So we've done the validation for products. Let's do the same for categories. So let's go to products. I'll just copy this code since I'm a bit lazy. I'll go over to categories, and in the categories table, I will say here, well, if this dot category name, please enter a valid category name. And in our show categories code, we'll do the same. We're going to say override on saving row and say categories dot validate input and send it the activity as a parameter. So now the validation works there as well. We'll go to show categories, delete it, line, enter valid category name, and it took us to the entity in the models namespace and took us to the code. Perfect. But as we can see, both the show suppliers needs to call, show products needs to call the validate input, and show categories needs to call the validate input, and I don't want that. I think that everything that uses show everything, okay, should call the validate input. But the validate input, okay, is a method of categories, and the validate input here is a method of product. But in the show everything, we're not aware of any such method. And we need to be able to identify entities that are validatable, okay? Now we can address common properties that every entity share, like we've done over here. Thank you for editing from.caption, because every entity has a caption name, but not every entity has validate input. Again, let me demo this. Let's go take this code from here and go to show everything. Try to put the on saving row here, and it says, well, I'm not aware of products. And if I change that to from, it will say, well, there's no method called validate input in the type entity. Okay, and we need to solve that. So I'm going to solve it now using an interface. I'm going to create an interface, and I'm going to call it I can validate. I'll just put it here. It doesn't really matter. So I'll say public. No, let's put it in a separate class just for the sake of making it organized. So in demo reusable, I'll add a new item of type interface and call it I can validate. Perfect. I'll make that here. So an object that can validate needs to have a validate method. Okay, so I'm going to go to show products or to the products entity and copy the validate input method and place it in my interface. Great. And it needs to be aware of the namespace here, so I'm going to use FireflyBox. Perfect. So now I have an interface called I can validate. In my code, I can check for this interface. Let me show you how I do that. I can say here, var I can validate equals from as I can validate the interface. Now the as keyword checks if from is of that interface, and if it's so, it will return its value here. So now I can say, well, if I can validate is not null, which means it can validate, then call the I can validate input, validate input. Right. So this line transfer or casts the objects from type entity to type I can validate, and if it succeeds, it's called its validate input method. Now all that we need to do now is take away the on saving row from the show products and show categories because they don't need it anymore. It's been replaced by the ones that exist in show everything, and we need to tell it that products is of type demo reusable, that's our namespace, I can validate. Just by saying this, it will know to get there. So let's put this one here, and let's not put it in categories for a second so we can see the difference. Great. So if I'll go now to show products and change the name to an invalid, I will get the message, even though there is no on saving row implementation in the show supplier, and there's no call to the validation in the show supplier, because all of that is happening in the show everything. Okay, and if I do the same to categories, it will not work because we didn't state that categories is of type I can validate. Okay, so categories, even though it has a method like this, doesn't implement the interface. So I'll implement the interface over here. And now the validation will happen for categories. Let's see how it works. Show categories. Get the validation. Great. And show products. I get the validation. Perfect. Let's review the changes that we've done. So we've added an interface called ICanValidate with a single validate method. We've deleted from the show products the on-saving row because we don't need that anymore. And we've placed it in the show everything, where we're actually checking if the main table, if the from is validatable, then we make it validate its input. Great.